So hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our UNICEF Echo Event. Before we get started, I'd like to state that I am thankful and grateful to live, work, and play on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, also known as Ottawa. And I'm just going to provide a brief sort of overview before I introduce the rest of our speakers today. So hopefully you can see that. Awesome. So today is an echo event of the UNICEF Report Card 17. So as you may know, the UNICEF Report Card 17 was launched yesterday, and this serves as an echo event specifically to discuss the role of outdoor play in meeting the report card indicators. So as you may know, with the launch of the report card yesterday, one of the big announcements was that Canada ranks 28th among 39 rich countries in the overall environmental well-being of children and youth, which is approximately the bottom third of the rankings, which is obviously not that ideal. This is based on rankings within individual indicators, which include, as they relate to outdoor play, children's environmental capital. So this is actually an area that we did the best in. So children, based on among several surveys, reported approximately 76% awareness of climate change and knowledge on climate change through educational initiatives. And we are second only to South Korea. From there, things get a little bit worse. So we rank 8th in terms of children's and youth's exposure to air pollution. In terms of access to urban green space, we rank 15th, and this is largely as a result of rapid intensification and urbanization of our city centers, and with that, the reduction of green spaces. And finally, among one of the worst rankings that we have are child traffic injuries and death, in which we rank 23rd out of 39 rich countries. And this is a consequence of, it's just over, I'm going to get the statistics wrong now, but it's just over 100 child traffic injuries and deaths per 1,000 on a daily basis, which is really remarkable and should be addressed. So in order to discuss the role of outdoor play in terms of addressing these indicators and meeting and addressing the indicators, we are going to have a panel discussion today featuring Dr. Raktim Mitra from the Toronto Metropolitan University School of Urban and Regional Planning, formerly known as Ryerson University. He is also part of the Outdoor Play Canada Leadership Group. Then we have Dr. Richard Larouche from the University of Lethbridge within the Faculty of Health Sciences, and he's also the Director of Physical Activity, Transport, and Health Research Group. And finally, we have Gillian Petrini from the Canadian Partnership for Children's Health and Environment, and is also a Child and Nature Alliance of Canada practitioner. And so I'm just going to switch screens now and pass it over to Raktim to tell us a little bit about his work and how it intersects between outdoor play and the report card indicators.
Excellent. Thank you, Louise. It's a small group, so I think it's great in a way so that we can be a little informal. I mean, if we do short presentations and then save lots of time from discussion. So if there are questions, we are happy to discuss those. So I have titled my short presentation as Children's Outdoor Play and Neighborhood Environment. Outdoor play is important, as we know, because it's important for children's health and well-being. And as an urban planner in this presentation, I'd like to focus on how neighborhood design can be important, particularly when it comes to the resiliency of outdoor play. Next slide, please. So this is a quote directly from the report card, which says that each child, no matter where they live in the city, should be in easy walking distance from a safe and welcoming public green space. So of course, in this presentation, I'm trying to relate green space to outdoor play because these two are correlated sometimes, not always, which we will talk about. Now, in this statement, there are two specific aspects that the report is emphasizing. One is the accessibility to green space, how close they are. And the second one is creating a welcoming environment for public green space. And in a related discussion paper published in 2021, UNICEF Canada talked about several recommendations about how green spaces can be made more welcoming through partnerships with community and other private and public stakeholders. Next slide, please. Now, the report also says, as Louise has mentioned, that Canada ranks somewhere in the middle, 15th when it comes to accessibility to green space. In one of our studies in Toronto, we found that the majority of the children who are aged between 11 and 13 years old would have access to either a park or a school ground within less than half a kilometer from where they live. So the accessibility, physical accessibility is not as bad. So when we asked parents about what are the key barriers to children's outdoor play, not surprisingly, most of the barriers were related to the social environment of their neighborhood. Parents who were worried about children interacting with strangers, parents who thought that drivers are driving too fast in their neighborhood, parents, those were key barriers where when parents thought that there are lots of people in the neighborhood who are walking, talking, doing things with one another, those were an enabler to outdoor play for children. Whereas total park area within the vicinity of the neighborhood was not as associated, perhaps because there was not enough variations. Most people have physical access to public spaces. But Louise, if you could go to the next slide. The importance of urban green spaces are emphasized more, and this is what I wanted to focus on the second part of my presentation, is during the times of emergency. In this next few slides, I'd use the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic as sort of like a disruptive intervention to demonstrate the importance of where outdoor activities and outdoor play were resilient throughout the pandemic compared to where it was not. So in this slide, we did a survey back in 2020, asked parents about children's healthy movement behaviors. And as you can see that there's a mixed variety of responses that we received. But if you look at the blue bars here, that is the decline in various activity behaviors. You can see outdoor play, outdoor physical activity, and outdoor walking and biking are three things that declined the most during the time of the pandemic. And at the same time, screen time increased the most during the time of the pandemic. But the point that I'm trying to make is that these declines are not consistent across all types of neighborhoods. Louise, next slide. So if we group all these children, and we did this through a method called cluster analysis, we can kind of group all these children that we surveyed, about 1,500 children, into two groups. One group that were more resilient, we call them the increased children with increased outdoor activities. As you can see that they demonstrated a slight increase in almost every type of movement behaviors, both positive and negative. They were playing a little bit more outside, but at the same time, they were watching screens a little bit more as well. But then there's the second group, which is the majority of Canadian children and youth, about 56%. We are calling them children with decreased outdoor activities, and specifically they demonstrate a decline in walk and bike, physical activity and sports outside, physical activity inside, as well as outdoor play. So two broad groups. So the first group is more resilient, the second group is less resilient in public health crisis. Next slide, please. So then we wanted to see, well, so then what are the neighborhood conditions in which we could expect more resiliency toward outdoor activities, play and walk, bike, and things like that. And there's a few things that that came out of the modeling exercise that we did. Children who lived in houses versus apartments demonstrated an increased outdoor activity increased levels of outdoor activity overall. Dwelling density was negatively associated with increased outdoor activities, meaning that is high density neighborhoods within bigger cities across Canada saw a relatively higher decline. And the last one was about the accessibility to parks and open spaces. And let me discuss this a little bit more in the next slide. Louis, if you could. Okay. So here we can see how access to parks or open spaces was important at different density levels. So when children were living in low density neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods, villages, the accessibility to parks and open spaces were not important because most children were playing, at least during the time of the pandemic, in their backyard, front yard, the spaces in and around their neighborhood. But as the density went up, you can see that there's a very strong association between residential density and accessibility to parks and open spaces. So in very high density neighborhoods, children, when they had better access to parks and open spaces, were more likely to demonstrate resiliency when it came to maintaining outdoor physical activity and outdoor play. Next slide, Louise. So from that, basically, what I'm trying to say is that access to opportunities for outdoor activity, play, and recreation is critical, particularly critical during the time of public health emergencies such as the ongoing pandemic. Oftentimes when it comes to enabling play and outdoor activities, we think about community engagement and community programming, which are absolutely important, but more fundamentally, it's also important to consider open spaces as an important land use component when we are planning for these neighborhoods. That creates an opportunity critical opportunity in overcoming barriers to outdoor play for children and for others as well, because green space is important during the pandemic and when it is not pandemic. So I think that's it, Louise, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, so thank you everyone. Happy to chat after my other colleagues have done with their presentations.
Thank you so much, Raktim. That was wonderful. And we can probably stop sharing that. we will move on to Richard's brief introduction. And so if you have any questions, I suggest that you just hold on to them at the end. We're going to have a lot of time for discussion amongst the group. And so switch over to Richard's overview here. And Richard, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Louise. I was asked to discuss about the intersection between my research work and the indicators that are covered in the report card. So that's the way I structured my presentation today, and I'll have more time to engage with you during the question period at the end. Louise, can you go to the next slide? Yes, I would like to start from the moment that I started being involved in work related to outdoor play. That was around 2014, when we were working on the position statement on active outdoor play, which was released alongside the participation report card on physical activity for children and youth. And I was part of a large and multidisciplinary group that developed the position statement. There was, I think, around 20 or 25 members of the working group. And so the position essentially called for increased opportunities for children to be active outdoors in all settings, starting from the home to the neighborhood environment, school, etc. And it's also interesting to discuss in this context the pandemic, and that relates to what Raktim discussed in his presentation. And so especially in the early stages of the pandemic, there were a lot of playgrounds that were closed and reduced opportunities for children to be active outdoors, which also contributed to reduce physical activity. Next slide, please. So after we released the position statement, I did a series of research studies looking at the benefits of outdoor play for children and youth. And some of these studies use national data from the Canadian Health Measures Survey, which is our biggest survey in Canada that includes direct measures of physical activity. And what we found was that in 7 to 14-year-old children and youth, each additional hour that children spent outdoors was associated with a more moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity, more steps per day, also less sedentary time. But it was also interesting to look at some psychosocial indicators. In this case, we found that children who spend more time outdoors had less peer relationship problems, and they also had less psychosocial problems in general. And then we repeated a similar analysis with younger children, so 5 to 6-year-old, and similar to what we found with the older children, more time spent outdoors was associated with more physical activity, and also greater odds of meeting the physical activity guidelines for children and youth, which recommend 60 minutes of MVPA or moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. Next slide, please. Next, I led a study that we did in 3 major regions of Canada. So they correspond to the pictures that you see at the bottom of the screen. And so we had Ottawa was one of the sites as the capital of Canada. And we had Trois-Rivières in Quebec, so a medium-sized city, about 130,000 people. And finally, we had Vancouver in British Columbia. And in that study, we collected some data on outdoor play. We found that the time spent outdoors was the most consistent correlate of physical activity in both boys and girls. Unfortunately, we found that outdoor time decreased with age, and this decline was steeper in girls than in boys. Maybe it's partly because of the age group that we had. So it was 8 to 12 years old in this study. So maybe if we had adolescents, we might have seen a decrease in boys as well. I don't know that for sure, but that is just an hypothesis. And then we looked at some factors that were related with outdoor time. So we found that informal social controls, so kind of the social cohesion type of variables that Raktim was talking about in this presentation also emerged as being significant factors associated with outdoor time in our study. And we also found differences based on language spoken at home. So the children in families that spoke minority languages, so any language other than English and French, spent less time outdoors. And that is work submitted for publication by one of my students. Next slide, please. So a lot of my research work looks at active transportation. So active transportation involves walking and cycling to and from places, and it is an activity that takes place outdoors. So one of the things that children can do when they are outside. It's also an important source of physical activity. And one of the key barriers to using active transportation is road safety concern, as I was trying to get at with this image here. This can be seen in a developing country where there's lots of traffic and people don't follow the rules the same way that they do here in Canada. Next slide, please. So now moving on to the type of interventions that we can put in place to promote active transportation. And so this is something that is discussed in the book that I published a few years ago. And most of the interventions that exist today focus on the trip to and from school. And in addition to trying to increase active transportation, they also try to decrease road safety concerns, which is one of the main concern that parents have with respect to letting their children walk or bike to school, especially on their own. And so the type of interventions that are the most common will involve some form of accompaniment. And so this can be walking school buses, which are groups of children that walk together on a set route with adult volunteers to get to and from school. And there are also more comprehensive interventions that, in addition to offering activities, they might also include some changes to the road design itself, different events to promote walking and cycling, sometimes activities to increase enforcement of road laws, especially in school zones. And there's two types of interventions. So in Canada, we have what we call school travel planning, which is more of a grassroots initiatives to try to encourage kids to walk or bike to school, versus in other countries, and it started in Denmark, but it also exists in the UK, the US, and other countries. They have what we refer to as safe routes to school, which is a larger and typically more well-funded intervention that encourage more active transportation to school. And what we can see from previous studies is that the effectiveness of these interventions is highly variable. So you will see some interventions that achieve substantial increases in active transportation and some that don't. Next slide, please. And one of the concepts that I would like to bring forward to our discussion today is children's independent mobility. Because it's a positive construct. It is an enabler of outdoor play. So children who have more freedom to travel in their neighborhood without adult supervision are more likely to play outdoors. They're also more likely to engage in active transportation. But unfortunately, what we've seen in the last century or so is a major decline in the independent mobility of children. And this has been observed in many different countries. Independent mobility is also important because children will know their neighborhood better, tend to have a better environmental capital, so they're more aware of their surrounding, they have better wayfinding skills, and they are more likely to choose to travel by walking and cycling, which if it is something that is done at the level of a large population, that can lead to a decrease in vehicle emissions, so greenhouse gases and exhaust gases and so on. Next slide, please. So I would like to conclude with some ways forward for future research and for practice as well. And so a couple of things that we need include improve understanding of the disparities in children's access to opportunities for outdoor play, physical activity, and so on. And what I mean by disparities is differences between groups. And so an example of that would be the difference that we observed in outdoor time between children who spoke minority language at home versus children who spoke French or English at home. We also need to put in place different types of interventions to make the active choice the easy choice, to cite the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion. And we need interventions in different settings, so in the family settings, in schools, in cities, and so on. And finally, we need to recognize children's rights, which are guaranteed under the UN Charter for the Rights of Children, and also try to involve them a little bit more in the planning of their neighborhoods. And an example of intervention that does exactly that is the UNICEF's Child-Friendly Cities initiatives. And there's a few cities in Canada that have this initiative in place. So thank you for your attention. The next few slides are acknowledgements and the references that were used in my presentation.
Thanks so much, Richard. That was wonderful. And then we'll pass it over to Gillian last, and then get into a bit of discussion on everything that's been talked about so far, and what some intersections there may be. So let's pass it over here. Just get myself organized. Okay, Gillian, do you want to take it away?
I do. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Louise. My name is Gillian Petrini. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I would just like to first acknowledge that I am joining you from Coast Salish territory, specifically the unceded traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt, on whose lands I am a grateful guest. Today, I would like to speak to the work of the Canadian Partnership for Children's Health and Environment, and how that intersects with outdoor play, as well as the UNICEF Report Card 17. So next slide, Louise. Thank you. So KIPCHI, which is our affectionate acronym, is the Canadian Partnership for Children's Health and Environment. We are a national collaborative of organizations working together to improve children's environmental health in Canada, and have been doing so for over 20 years. I would like to acknowledge that Erica Phipps, our executive director, is also joining us on the call. I think she's here now or will join at some point. So welcome to Erica. Healthy Environments for Learning Day, also known as HELD, of which I am the project coordinator for, is a key initiative of KIPCHI, promoting children's health and well-being in learning environments. It's an annual campaign that has a key focus each year, and this year the focus was healthy and sustainable childcare environments. So I'll speak a little bit more to the work that we did around that. So next slide, please, Louise. So today I wanted to speak to the outdoor learning and play aspects, specifically within the context of learning environments in Canada. So early learning environments, childcare, and schools. As children spend 6+ hours on average in childcare and school settings, the quality of these settings is crucial. And these settings can impact children's health and their lifelong health trajectories as well. So as part of this year's HELD campaign, there was an interest in learning more about the current conditions and practices within childcare settings across Canada, as it relates specifically to environmental health and sustainability. So a survey was conducted this year in March of childcare practitioners, and this was done by KIPCHI and the Canadian Childcare Federation in collaboration with researchers from the University of Ottawa. Over 2,000 childcare respondents completed the survey of their views and experiences. And this survey really gives us some insights into what's happening on the ground and in the fields. It's one slice of a larger picture, but it does provide some really key, interesting findings, opportunities, needs, and gaps. So today I want to layer some of those survey results as it relates to outdoor play and the report card. So next slide, please. So the UNICEF report card identifies 3 levels that describe children's environmental conditions and experiences. So first looking at the world of the child, which connects to that direct relationship to their environment. So things like air and water, and then expanding out to the world around the child, which is their surrounding environment. So such things as traffic and green spaces. And then expanding even further to the world at large. So that global picture, looking at ecological integrity. So things like consumption, emissions, climate change, climate action, and climate education. So I want to begin by looking at the world of the child around air quality, specifically outdoor air quality. So the world of the child is literally impacted with every single breath that they take. Outdoor air quality, it can impact children's health, with infants and young children being at a higher risk of health implications and problems with when exposed to air pollution. So from the childcare survey that was done this year, some of the results from the respondents, from the over 2,000 respondents, are as follows here. So almost 30% reported that there was noticeable air pollution or fumes at their childcare program, at their setting. Half reported that their childcare program was within 1 kilometer of the nearest highway, and 80% was within 1 kilometer of the nearest major roadway, with 1/3, reporting being within 5 kilometers of the nearest polluting industry or other potential source of contaminants. So the implications of this are the exposure to traffic pollution, whether it's proximity to traffic corridors, major roadways, idling, and all of this can cause a whole host of health problems for our children, from developing and worsening of asthma to allergies to reducing lung function, heart disease, and many other unfortunate impacts, including child leukemia as well. Factories and other industrial facilities, such as dry cleaners, gas stations, are all examples of sources of pollution that can also pose risk to children's health. And as Louise pointed out in the beginning, Canada and the UNICEF report card ranks 8th in children's exposure to ambient air pollution, 29th in the rate of illness from air pollution, and 41st in our carbon emissions, which is not good. Next slide, please. So expanding out to the world around the child, I want to look at green space. So we know just how important green spaces are. The benefits of green space is so far reaching for children and also for families and extending to the general community. But it's also ensuring that these green spaces are healthy and sustainable. So in the survey results, it was found, this is a positive, that 80% of those respondents reported having an outdoor play area adjacent to the childcare program. So a good likelihood that those children are going out when that adjacent outdoor play area is right there, with a high percentage reporting that they had that. However, 42% indicated that the outdoor play area was without adequate shade, which is a concern, great concern with rising temperatures. 1/3 having outdoor artificial turf, 1/3 having pavement on most or all of their outdoor play area, 1/4 without natural vegetation, and 21.5% using lawn and garden pesticides or herbicides on a regular basis. So we know that these green spaces are so important, and that health and sustainable piece of these green spaces is key, as well as the accessibility and ensuring that they are equitable in terms of their access. As Louise mentioned before, Canada ranked 15th in terms of urban green space on their index. Next slide, please. And then expanding out to the world at large, so ecological integrity, specifically around climate change. This was an interesting piece that was highlighted in the survey. So of the respondents, 68% indicated that they were very or somewhat concerned about climate change and how climate change would impact the children in their care. However, only 1 in 5 reported that their childcare program is actually taking action on reducing climate emissions or addressing climate change. So high concern, low action happening there. Next slide, please. So all this to highlight that there is much work to be done. Part of this year's campaign was also a collaborative vision statement for healthy and sustainable childcare. This vision statement has been part of an active campaign at all levels of government and with all stakeholders to ensure healthy and sustainable childcare in Canada. Part of this vision statement was 10 core elements that included such things as looking at proximity to traffic corridors and sources of pollution. So wanting them to be as far away as possible. So having that as one key element, looking at access to green spaces, healthy and sustainable green spaces, land-based learning, getting children outside and engaged in nature-based programming, taking climate action and mitigating climate impacts. Other initiatives that Kipchi is a part of is the electrification of school buses and looking at reducing emissions through electrification instead of the diesel school bus. And also we are involved in many other things, but also including CBER reform, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and working collaboratively with others on that. Equally important with these big, broader initiatives is the everyday actions that really make a difference as well. So as part of our campaign, we launched the Healthy and Sustainable Childcare Checklist and Resource Hub, which is a very engaging and informative online platform where anyone can go and access information on environmental health and everyday actions that they can take around such things as reducing exposure for children to air pollution, looking at greening initiatives, gardening, getting children outside, modeling climate action, and supporting children and youth and their calls for action around climate change. So all of these big and everyday are all really important actions for change and all important ways that we can be agents for change. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much to Raktim, Richard, and Gillian for those wonderful presentations. That was awesome. Let me just get myself organized here. So I think what this, like Raktim mentioned, we have a reasonably small group here. So maybe I'll put it first out to our panelists and to those in attendance on some initial thoughts or questions or reflections. Maybe I can get it started with a light question, because Gillian, I was listening, I was like, okay, I understand. And then you mentioned that point about 1/3 of childcare centers having artificial outdoor turf. Why? It seems like such an arbitrary and expensive, and anyway, maybe it's just a light way for us to get started on the topic, but.
Mm-hmm. It is, it's an interesting thing that is happening in childcare, and I also see it in education settings too, that the idea of greening is involving artificial turf. I don't think that practitioners or educators have the full understanding of what that entails and what they're bringing into their care centers. And so that education piece, I think, is really, really important. But it is an interesting kind of trend, an interesting and unfortunate trend that is happening. So I think that education piece really needs to be to be brought forward. Yeah, and I can see that, Mark. Yeah, so yeah, no maintenance, no pesticides. And Erica has some thoughts on that too. Good question.
Yes, maybe just to add to what Gillian was saying, we didn't share the other statistic, but it's also being used indoors. So childcare programs reporting having artificial turf indoors. So in addition to it, in an outdoor setting, not actually being green space, being a form of artificial space. And I think, Mark, you're right, the no maintenance, no pesticides. I know in our local school, the reason is there's just so many kids that the turf was getting churned up into, mud, basically. So they reverted to having artificial turf. But from an environmental health perspective, it's also of concern too, because some of these artificial turf, the materials, it's plastics, sometimes there's crumb rubber, other materials that have been reclaimed that can be a source of exposure to plasticizers, heavy metals, and so forth. So there is research from a toxics exposure perspective, as well as the concerns about actually having kids in natural outdoor spaces.
And that what it also brings up to that point of, we're trying, when childcare centers are, attempting to meet quotas on naturalizing or greening up their outdoor spaces, it feels sort of like this artificial method of doing so, and really missing the spirit of what that's trying to accomplish. And so I wondered too, Raktim, when you were talking about, creating or having open spaces in new neighborhoods, do you see any concern with, rapid densification and ensuring that green spaces are available in neighborhoods, that it's actually being done, as opposed to maybe just having spaces that haven't yet been developed and calling those the open public spaces or some equivalent to that? Oh,
Well,
oh yeah, go ahead.
I mean, we can see the awareness growing, right? I mean, for over the last 20 or so years, I mean, central neighborhoods in large cities have densified significantly, but there was no variations in the way this densification has happened. Basically, another way to say this is that this densification has not happened with children in mind. These condos were not built for families with children. Now that many municipalities are pushing for it, there's clearly more awareness from the perspective of developers, as well as push from the municipalities to think about creative ways to incorporate green space. So my understanding is that going forward, we will see more happening in terms of creating green spaces within these dense neighborhoods. I mean, the way urban planning works in these things, and these densified spaces are almost all of them are built based on a mechanism that's called the density bonus. So basically, developers come to the city council and say that we want to build 10 extra stories of a building compared to what is allowed within the zoning. And in return, we will give municipalities something in exchange. Typically, until about 10 years ago, 5 to 10 years ago, municipalities would ask for, trees or, public art or sidewalks and things like that. So there is clearly an opportunity where municipalities, if they want to, they can force developers to build green spaces in exchange for added density. So the mechanism is there, but as I said, the densification over the last 20 years did not really happen with families with children in mind. Now that that is something that municipalities are considering in the context of the severe housing shortage and whatnot. I think there's an opportunity here, and we could possibly see more open space, children-centered open space in dense urban centers.
And do you think, this question can go either to Raktim or to Richard. Do you think it's also, it's in part urban planning, but it also feels like it may be part adults' mentalities around where children are permitted to go and what is safe and how far a child can go? I don't know, Richard or Raktim, do you have any thoughts on that? Shifting those mentalities?
Yeah, I think there's also a need for kind of soft interventions to try to get parents to reconsider how much independent mobility they give to their child. So I'm aware of some work that was led by Mariana Brusani's team in British Columbia, where they design what they call a risk reframing interventions that is can also be delivered both in person or online, and so it's a very scalable intervention that can help parents reconsider what are the benefits and the risk associated with granting permissions to their child to do things like climbing trees and normal things that children used to do 20, 40 years ago.
And the other thing too that I, is maybe an opportunity based on the report card indicators. Canada does really well in terms of informing and teaching children about climate change and environmental impacts. And so, I wonder if there's an opportunity here to find ways for children and youth to speak out about, what they need in terms of being able to then actually convert that knowledge into, being able to have more independence, being able to, go farther on their bikes, having access to those trails and to those park systems. Somehow, that there's a knowledge mobilization issue there. We have children are obviously very knowledgeable now, or are aware of the issues, but it doesn't seem to be translating quite into practice as much as we'd like.
Yeah, I mean, Louise, to your point, I think it's absolutely important that that this child education part is absolutely important, because, at around 11, 12 years age, Richard does work on this. We've done some work. Children begin to play an important role in making these decisions and negotiating decisions around where they play, where they go, and how they grow. So if these children are growing up with this knowledge of the importance of play, importance of environment, it changes the dynamics of these household decisions. And we have seen those in many surveys or interviews that we've done over the past years. But at the same time, like you said, involving communities is an important thing, and we do see a lot, maybe not at the rate that we want, but we're seeing some interesting things happening. Unfortunately, there's a lack of national coordinated efforts in doing this, and we have seen move towards what they'd called pop-up playgrounds, for example, where on a day they change green spaces into playgrounds using flexible materials. We now, many of the municipalities in coordination with community partners are implementing what they call the play strips. It's more common in Europe, not so much in North America, but these are happening in several suburban municipalities across GTHA starting this year. They are doing it. So I think these small scale community driven interventions are really important in kind of breaking those barriers where parents are just scared of letting go of their children, which for some reason over the past couple of decades, it seems like as parents, we have lost that confidence that children can actually play on streets or an open space in the neighborhood on their own. So community advocacy is absolutely important.
And I think it's an interesting idea of when children become teenagers, that's when they start exercising that their desire to be a little bit more independent. And then you see things like that show on Netflix, Old Enough, where you have 2- and 3-year-olds given full independence to walk, 1 kilometer to the grocery store. I don't know if anyone on the call has seen it, but what is remarkable is that the parent has entrusted the child. The child has faith in themselves. And then when they get to the grocery store employees aren't terrified that there is a 2- and 3-year-old on their own. They see them and they ask how they can support them in achieving their mission and their goal and their errand list. And so, when perhaps, because Gillian, so much of what you were talking about starts in early childhood education. If this was Japan, those children would also be involved in active transportation, may actually have voices in terms of how they use those spaces. So it's just interesting because it's perhaps we're not thinking broadly enough about when children should and could have a voice. Yeah, Mark,
it's a very good point that's raised, and I think sometimes the parents fear being judged by other parents. So there's this social factor that we need to take into account. So if parents see, for example, our parents restricting the mobility of 10 or 11 years old, they might do the same. And so in addition to working with the parents individually, there could be a need for broader interventions.
Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple reactions and possible questions, I guess, to the comments so far. The most recent comment from Raktim about the loss of confidence, that somewhere we've lost confidence, and yeah, I think that's a piece of it, but there also, we've become a world that does balance sheets by only assessing one side of the balance sheet, and this is about risk in general, so we're completely oblivious to the benefits, or we discount them, and so when we're thinking about the lack of confidence or the risk associated with something or whatever, that's all we're thinking about. That's all parents are conditioned to think about. And I think the media has a lot to do with that. We sensationalize very, very rare events that scare the hell out of people. And then documentaries are made for Netflix and we watch those and get more scared and so on. So I think part of it is just the rationality with our decision making, and perhaps the excessive time we apparently have as parents. I think I played alone as a kid, not because my parents had any confidence in me whatsoever. They couldn't be bothered being so involved in my life. I mean, that's just not what they did. It was a different time. But that's one point. Another response to an earlier comment by Raktim about green space, and I think Raktim, you painted a fairly rosy picture about the future and how even with densification we can preserve green space and so on. I mean, it's not the reality. I am living here in suburban Ottawa right now. I mean, the golf course that I live on is probably going to be destroyed. There's a big fight going on. It's an election issue for us, you know, but where we have an 18-hole golf course where there was a signed agreement that it would never, ever be anything but green space. They've got a petition in to make 1,500 homes instead. And it's the same, doesn't matter what direction you go from my house, every inch of green space is being cementized. And it's, I know this is just a personal anecdote, but I see it, and at Outdoor Play Canada, we hear it from other people, and this is in part why they're seeking thought leadership information from us about how they can push back on this destruction, this just constant destruction, to make really wealthy people really wealthier. But anyways, those were just a couple of reflections, but two comments perhaps that people could reflect on. So I'm at home now in my home office, which is my only office now and will be for the remainder of my career. And many people are like me. And I'm right beside a high-tech park, Canada's biggest high-tech park here in Canada. And increasingly, the people there can work from anywhere. They don't even need to be in Canada, frankly, to work for the companies that are here. And I'm just wondering for the panelists whether or not they see any potential for a de-urbanization movement and anything that we could do to try and facilitate that. There's no reason why. I come from Bracebridge, Ontario, so those that are from Ontario might know, you know, so that's cottage country, a little town. There are many little towns like this. And now I'm living in a big urban center. And that's, of course, what happens with so many people. But I could live in Bracebridge and do my job. I might have to come to the hospital here every once in a while. But I wonder, given the fact that we've proven with this natural experiment that people can work almost anywhere. Now, everyone can't do it. A surgeon can't do it, and a police officer can't do it. But many of us can work from almost anywhere. I wonder if that is something that we could be capitalizing on. And my last point, and Gillian said this, and I think this is the key thing, although I don't know that we have an answer for it. But at one point, Gillian, you said, you know, there's high concern but low action. And isn't that just the testament to the issues of all the panelists and so on? And how on earth I guess this is rhetorical, but how do we flip that cycle? Thanks.
Well, thanks, Mark. We have just a couple more minutes, so maybe we'll let everyone else ponder on that. But Erica, do you want to see your hands raised, and then Christine?
Sure, thanks. So I do have a sort of a question to put out there as well, but just briefly in response to what Mark, you just flagged, that high concern, low action is sort of a nice segue into what I was interested in hearing from the panelists, which is the connection to climate action. So within KIPSHE, we've been thinking a lot about you know, shifting learning environments to be healthier, more resilient. But I'm also captured by the term active hope, because we all know that our children are suffering eco-anxiety. This is getting worse. And I'm interested in hearing about people's thoughts about to what extent we already are, or perhaps could be doing more to link some of the work that you're doing, such as active transportation, to leadership, youth leadership, to be part of the solution. Gillian mentioned that we're involved in school bus electrification. And of course, as KIPSHE, we speak to, you know, reduction of diesel exposure and the sort of bad side of the equation, but I'm also increasingly captured by the symbolism of, you know, on the downside, asking kids to ride to school in a diesel school bus, which is part of the problem. They know the problem. These kids are literate on climate change, versus what we're hoping for, which is that kids that are bused to get an education can actually ride to school on part of the solution. And I'm interested in hearing how we can be reframing some of the outdoor play, some of the active transportation, and probably lots of other things to be part of that active hope, to tap into the leadership and knowledge of young people and steer things in that direction, maybe a little less on physical activity and air pollution reduction, and a bit more on being part of the future that they, of course, all want us to be working towards. Anyway, I was just curious to hear people's thoughts on that.
Recognizing that it's 1 o'clock and Christine still has her hand up. I don't want to jump over all these conversations, but I do want to make sure that thoughts are brought forward. Christine, I don't know if you want to say something, and then if our panelists are willing to stay a couple minutes, then we can maybe continue the conversation.
Yeah, it feels like we're just getting started now. Thanks so much to everyone. I was just, I was picking up on something that I saw across the report card, Raktim, Richard, and Gillian. All of that stuff was around the traffic issue. And I just thought, if we think about when reports come to us and what we can leverage and what we can do things about, I was interested around, who are our partners and where's the interest around the traffic issues, since, we're one of the worst. And that's always something to leverage. Raktim has the research that says, it's one of parents' #1 concerns. And Gillian brought in the piece around how centers are just always located near major roadways. So I just wondered if that was a piece of intersectionality that, I'm curious, is anybody actually already picked up on it and working on it? Or is that something, on the long list of the many things that we could all try to do together? It just seemed like an interesting piece to tap into.
Panelists, any thoughts on the barrage of ideas that have just come through?
Yeah, I like the idea of trying to bridge that gap between concern about climate change and action. So I teach in public health at the University of Lethbridge, and I have a population health course that I offer to second year public health student. And the first year where I was there, I was almost scared that I would be sued or something like that if I thought about climate change, because it's Alberta and lots of people work in the oil and gas industry and so on. But I was pleasantly surprised that I didn't receive any negative critique about that, and I even had some positive comments. And a few years ago, before the pandemic, there was the student strike where with Greta Thunberg from Sweden, and so I went there and saw some of my students, and they were happy to say that I took the time to be there. But I think one of the ways to bridge that gap is to try to involve children, adolescents, and even young adults in decision making about places that are designed for them, and involve them in a genuine way, so not so much as a rubber stamping process.
I'll just jump in really quickly. There's so many things I could say, but I'll try to speak very specifically to a couple of things just around the traffic piece. So much recent reporting has come out. There's been 2 recent reports around traffic-related air pollution through Health Canada, CAPE, so the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment just put out a recent report. So there's so much information, and it comes back to that. There's the high concern, so where are the actions? So lots of ideas coming forward. And I just wanted to speak to the part specifically around childcare settings, that we are in a very unique situation here in Canada, that we're at the intersection of investments happening across all provinces and territories around childcare. And so thousands, I don't have my exact numbers, but of spaces are going to be created over the next couple of years. So there's this optimal time. We have all this information to make these spaces not just about creating space for the sake of space, but looking at like, where is that proximity? Where are these high traffic corridors? And how are we going to decide where our childcare centers are going, where our childcare placements are happening in terms of, traffic and in terms of green spaces. So I think it's just, there's opportunities for campaigning, which again takes lots of effort, but collaborative, collective efforts. The vision statement included these concepts, but just to highlight that there is this opportune time in Canada around childcare.
Thank you for that. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so maybe we'll wrap it up there. If you have any sort of follow-up questions, feel free to. Maybe what we can do is I can put our Outdoor Play Canada email here, which you're welcome to shoot me any emails, and then I can maybe coordinate people as the needs come up. But thank you so much for this. That was great, and I'm looking forward to working with the three of you and in coming up with some of the solutions moving forward. So with that, we'll say goodbye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Have a
you,
great
everyone.
day.
Thank you, everybody.